It was one of those evenings when the world seems like an abandoned place, and every little thing makes you feel even more lonely. Gusts of cold wind carried wet leaves with them, hurling them onto sidewalks and streets. The sky was darkening, as if hanging over the city like a heavy blanket, ready to smother the last rays of light. The girl named Adai was in no hurry to get home. Her heart was in turmoil, and her mind was confused about the future. Loneliness that she hadn't noticed before was slowly creeping into her mind, wrapping around her like an old wool scarf. And so, when she was about to walk away from the streets full of people, from their noise and indifference, she noticed him. An old man was sitting in an alley, right under the faint light of a street lamp. He looked like a part of this city, exhausted, battered, as if he had been taken away from life and thrown on the cold, wet ground. Her pace slowed down. She could have just walked by. It would be simpler and perhaps even more correct. But something inside stopped her. It was as if an invisible force had clung to her heart, forcing her to take a step to the side. Adai took a closer look at the old man. His skin was dark and wrinkled, like the cracked bark of an ancient tree. Raindrops glistened on her face, or were they tears? She wasn't sure.
Are you okay?
Her voice sounded unexpected even to herself. The old man slowly raised his head. His eyes, deep, almost black, bored into hers. For a moment it seemed to her that the whole universe was hidden in them, with its joys and sorrows, with secrets that no one knows about. He was silent, but the silence was strangely expressive.
Can't you hear me?
Adai raised her voice a little, trying to overcome the strange tension that hung over them.
Do you need help?
He shook his head, as if waking up from a long sleep.
No one needs help anymore,
He said softly.
We all just exist until it's time to leave.
A strange chill gripped her, but not the one that the wind brought, but the one that gets inside, making the blood run faster.
You don't have to. Just sitting here.
She continued, peering into his face, trying to catch at least some of his emotions.
If you have nowhere to go, you can come to my place. It's not...
He was looking at her as if he was trying to understand something, to remember something. And then, with a barely perceptible nod, he began to slowly get to his feet. His movements were heavy, labored, as if every step was a feat for him.
What's your name?
Adai asked, holding out her hand to help him up.
Abel,
The old man replied almost in a whisper, but there was an ancient, elusive undertone in his voice, as if his name had been pronounced centuries before this street appeared.
I'm Adai.
She said in response, surprised at how easy it was for her to make this acquaintance. They walked together through the streets, illuminated by the dim light of lanterns that seemed to struggle with the surrounding darkness. The wind occasionally lifted dry leaves from the sidewalk, hurling them at their feet, as if to emphasize that the two of them were the only living souls on this street.
why are you here?
Adai finally decided to ask. Abel looked at her out of the corner of his eye, but lowered his head again, as if the weight of these questions was too great for a simple answer.
Sometimes life, it just gets empty.
He said,
People leave, dreams dissolve, and you are left in the dark. And when darkness envelops you, you no longer seek light.
her heart sank at his words. She didn't know what to say. This man seemed to have lived 1,000 lives, and each of them ended too soon, leaving him among the rubble of the past.
Might, you can find something new.
She suggested, although she understood how naive it sounded.
Knife doesn't stop.
Abel looked at her again, and his tired eyes suddenly lit up with something she couldn't decipher.
You're young.
He said, as if with a slight smile.
You don't know yet that there are times when it's easier to give up than to keep fighting.
They came to her house. A small, cozy house stood among the trees, which, like guards, sheltered it from the rest of the world. The door opened with a slight creak, and warm air hit my face. Abel froze on the threshold, as if he did not believe that he had been invited to enter.
Come in.
Adai said softly, taking a step to the side.
It's warm here.
The old man came in, but still did not take off his old shabby jacket, as if he was ready to leave at any moment.
Is this your house?
He asked, looking around, but doing it so carefully, as if he was afraid of destroying something.
Yes.
New, she replied, closing the door behind him.
I've been living here for several years.
Are you alone?
His question sounded like a statement, and she nodded in response. They stood in silence until there was a light patter of rain on the windows, and the sound seemed to diffuse the tension. Adai glanced at the old man, who, despite his fatigue and external fragility, looked surprisingly majestic. There was something ancient in his posture and movements, something that did not fit in with the image of a simple homeless old man.
Would you like some tea?
Shortelt, she finally suggested, feeling how worried she was by this silence. He looked at her and, to her surprise, smiled slightly.
Yes, tea would be nice.
While Adai was making tea, they exchanged a few words again but were mostly silent. And that silence seemed to be full of meaning, as if there was something between them that didn't need to be discussed, something that just happened. When she returned with the cups, Abel was still deep in thought. But when he picked up the cup, she noticed that his fingers were trembling slightly. He raised the cup to his lips and took a sip, then stared at it for a long time.
Your kind idea.
He finally said.
But kindness sometimes brings pain.
Her eyes widened at those words, but she didn't know what to say. Everything that happened that evening seemed strange, but somehow natural. It was as if they were both part of something bigger, something that went beyond ordinary meetings.
I'm not afraid of pain.
She replied, looking him straight in the eye.
Sometimes it's the only thing that makes you feel alive.
Abel was looking at her, his gaze penetrating to the very depths of her soul, and Adai felt that this evening was the beginning of something unexpected, something that could change her whole future. The warm lamplight softly enveloped the room, muffling the cold shadows that crept through the windows outside. There was always a cozy atmosphere in Adai's house. Wooden shelves, books scattered in a chaotic manner, and a couple of old paintings on the walls, which she had not paid attention to for a long time. But this night, everything seemed different. The feeling of a stranger's presence in her house made every corner seem more alive, tense. She was sitting in an armchair opposite Abel, who finally took off his old jacket and left it hanging on the back of a chair. He sat slightly bent over, as if under the weight not only of time, but also of something invisible, the weight of a life lived.
It's been a long time.
Adai paused, realizing that her question might sound rude, but Abel already looked up, as if waiting for her to continue.
How long has it been since I became useless to anyone?
He finished for her, smiling slightly from the corner of his lips. She blushed, embarrassed that her thought had been so clearly read, but nodded in response.
Years don't matter when you lose everything. Time is just getting a current in which you don't know how many days, months have passed. Maybe years?
He tilted his head as if lost in memory. At some point, you just stop. Her gaze darted to the window, where the rain had increased again behind the glass, as if to emphasize his words. Her heart sank with pity, even though she understood that Abel was not one to be easily broken. No, there was something more, ancient, perhaps even powerful about him, something that continued to attract her, despite his age and outward fragility.
You can stay with me if you want.
She said, realizing that it sounded sudden and too bold. She quickly added,
At least until the rain stops. It's still night outside, it's cold.
Abel gave her a long, penetrating look. His eyes seemed to penetrate into the very essence of her soul, studying her every impulse, every thought.
You do realize that this may not be temporary, right?
He spoke softly, and his voice trembled with the bitterness hidden in it.
When you open the doors of your house to someone, you're discovering something more.
Her heart was pounding harder. What did he mean by that? Something more? What kind of secret was this man hiding, who seemed to be both simple and mysterious at the same time? She hesitated, choosing her words.
I do not know what you mean. I just can't leave you out there in the rain.
Her voice sounded confident, but tension was growing inside her. It seemed to her that Abel was talking about something she couldn't understand, as if he was seeing a future that hadn't come yet.
Your kindness is rare in this world,
he said slowly, lowering his gaze again.
But sometimes it can cause more pain than indifference.
His words gave her a strange feeling, as if he was warning her about something important. But despite this, she felt more and more attracted to him. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe she wanted to know more about his past, about what made him end up on the street. Or maybe it was something else, deeper, something she couldn't explain yet.
You can sleep in the guest room.
Nin, she finally said, standing up and pointing toward the hallway.
Mo, it should be warm enough there.
Abel did not immediately react. He sat quietly, as if weighing her offer. Then he stood up slowly, his movements smooth, almost graceful despite his age. He nodded, thanking her with a look, and moved to the door she indicated.
Thank you.
Hin, he said, pausing on the threshold of the room.
Your kindness will remain in my heart.
He disappeared through the door, and I was left alone in the living room. She stood for a long time looking at the closed door, thinking that this man had not come into her life by chance. A feeling of anxiety and some kind of inexplicable affection grew in her, although she tried to suppress it. Succumbing to fatigue, she slowly made her way to her bedroom, but the night did not bring her peace. She was lying in her bed, curled up under a warm blanket, but she couldn't sleep. Thoughts of the old man in the next room did not leave her. She could hear the rain continuing to drum on the roof, but it was no longer the sound that had calmed her before. Now it seemed ominous, as if nature itself had warned her about something. Several hours have passed. The silence in the house was almost palpable, but it only made it worse. She felt that she was not alone in this house, not because Abel was in the next room, but because there was something in her soul now that she couldn't say out loud yet. Suddenly, she heard soft footsteps. Her heart stopped for a moment. It was Abel, she knew for sure. He wasn't sleeping, but something seemed to be in his steps. Unnatural, as if he was moving so as not to be noticed. She sat up in bed. Her breathing became ragged. What was he doing? Why was he walking around the house in the middle of the night? Maybe he just couldn't sleep. Or else, light filtered through the curtains, creating bizarre shadows on the floor of the room. Her gaze was fixed on the door, waiting for Abel to knock or enter without permission. But nothing happened. Her fear was mixed with curiosity. She got out of bed, put on a bathrobe, and quietly stepping barefoot on the cold floor, headed for the door. When she went out into the hallway, she saw that the light in the guest room was turned off, but the door was ajar. She came closer and peered cautiously inside. Abel was sitting on the edge of the bed, his face in shadow. He wasn't sleeping. She could feel it in the way his breathing remained even, but too focused. He seemed to be waiting for her.
You can't sleep. What is it?
She asked softly, almost in a whisper. He didn't answer right away, as if he was considering her question.
Sleep is a luxury that you can't always afford.
He finally said.
Match. Sometimes you don't want the next day to come.
Her heart sank again at his words. She took a step closer, not knowing what was pushing her forward.
Why do you say that? What is it?
She asked, barely holding back tears.
What happened in your life? What are you here?
He sighed, his shoulders sagged, and for a moment he seemed incredibly vulnerable to her.
Life.
He said softly.
It passes, and you are left alone with what you did not have time to do, what you lost. Sometimes, Adair, it's better not to remember.
She sat down next to him on the bed, not knowing what to say. She felt that there was an invisible connection between them, something deep that could not be explained in words. She just knew that her life wouldn't be the same anymore.
But you're not alone.
She said, barely moving her lips.
Now, you are not alone.
Abel turned his head, and their eyes met in the dim light of the night. His eyes were full of pain and something else, something she couldn't understand. It was like a magnet that pulled her towards him, making her forget everything that was important before this meeting. And at that moment, she knew she couldn't just let him go. This man, despite his age and mysterious aura, had somehow become a part of her life. And even though she couldn't explain how or why, she knew one thing. There was something more ahead of them. The morning came quietly in the house, but the tension in the air was palpable, as if an invisible string stretched between Adai and Abel was about to burst. The sun barely broke through the dense clouds, leaving a dim light that only emphasized their fatigue after a sleepless night. Adai felt something strange, inexplicable in herself. Her thoughts kept returning to Abel, to his deep, ancient eyes, his quiet words, and the incomprehensible feeling that was gradually growing in her chest. She went down to the kitchen, feeling like every cell in her body was waiting for something inevitable. Abel was already there. He was sitting at the table, his old hands on his lap, and his gaze was fixed somewhere in the distance, out the window. He looked so alien to this house, but somehow he seemed to be part of her world, a world that was closed to everyone except the two of them.
Morning.
She muttered, not daring to look at him directly.
Morning.
Abel replied softly, but his voice was so deep that it caused a slight tremor in her heart. She put the kettle on the stove, trying not to pay attention to this constant inner flutter. But with each of his looks, with each of his movements, this feeling only intensified.
How did you sleep? What is it?
He asked after a while, looking at her. His question caught her off guard. She hadn't expected such interest, especially after that stressful night.
Not really.
She admitted, lowering her eyes.
Too many thoughts.
Abel nodded, as if he understood more than she could put into words.
Thoughts can be a heavy burden.
He said softly, as if he were talking not only to her, but also to himself.
Especially when you don't know what to do with them.
Her heart began to beat faster. She understood that these words were not accidental. He felt the same way, this tension, this strange, inexplicable attraction that was slowly but inexorably pulling them both in.
You.
She started to speak, but her voice faltered. She took a deep breath, trying to pull herself together.
Have you ever felt yourself lost? Like you can't find your place?
Her words were full of personal meaning, but she didn't know how else to describe this whirlwind of emotions that was rising in her. She felt that she was talking not only about him, but also about herself, about what she felt with each of his appearances, with each of his looks. Abel was silent for a long time before answering. His gaze was still fixed somewhere outside the window, but now he seemed even more focused.
A place is not a house, not walls, and not a city.
He finally said.
These are people. Those with whom you find peace, or those who bring you war.
She froze in place, startled by his words. There was something so personal about them that they touched her more deeply than she expected. Her mind was racing, but she couldn't find the answers. It wasn't just an unexpected attraction, it was like something fateful that she couldn't control. The kettle squealed, releasing steam, as if breaking this tense silence, and Adai hurried to remove it from the stove. She made 2 cups of tea, but when she put one in front of Abel, her hand trembled slightly. Their fingers accidentally touched, and it was like lightning. A small moment that changed everything. He looked up, meeting her gaze, and that moment seemed like an eternity. There was pain in his eyes, longing, but also something else, something deeper that was difficult for her to read. It was as if they both realized that there was more between them than just a late-night conversation in the dark. And this more began to manifest itself. She quickly pulled her hand away, as if she had been burned, and stepped back, trying to cope with the surging emotions. But it was too late. They both knew what had happened. The invisible thread between them now became tangible, like the air they shared, like the space they were in.
You feel it.
He said, not asking a question but asserting. She didn't know what to say. It was pointless to lie. There really was something between them that couldn't be explained. It was a strange, inexplicable attraction that pulled them deeper and deeper.
Yes.
She whispered, barely audibly, hardly realizing that she was saying these words. He sighed, his eyes filled with something ancient again, as if the whole world was a heavy burden for him.
This is wrong.
He said softly.
You have to understand that. I'm just a shadow of the past. And you're just starting to live.
She lowered her head, feeling a wave of anxiety sweep over her. He's right, it was all wrong. She couldn't explain why she felt this way about the old man, why she was attracted to him like a magnet. And yet it was there, inside her, this feeling that she couldn't get rid of.
It doesn't matter.
She said suddenly, lifting her eyes and looking him straight in the face.
I can't control it. And you too.
Abel met her gaze again, and in his eyes she saw the same thing. She felt herself, the same powerlessness in front of these incomprehensible forces that brought them together.
We're both in this together.
She added, no longer shy about her words. He nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth of her words, although his face remained serious.
It's dangerous. Been.
He said.
For you. For me. And yet.
He didn't finish, but she didn't need to hear the rest. She already knew what he wanted to say. This and yet hung in the air, between them, like an inevitability. No matter how hard they tried to deny this attraction, it continued to grow, like an invisible force forcing them to move towards each other. They sat in silence, enjoying their tea, but the tension only increased. Everything in the house seemed to be quiet, as if the very space between them acknowledged that something important was about to happen. At some point, Abel stood up. His movements were smooth as always. He took a step towards the door, but then stopped, turning to her.
"I'd better go.
He said softly, his voice full of bitterness.
This shouldn't go on."
Her heart began to beat faster, and she stood up as if by instinct, not letting him go. Her voice was low but determined.
Don't go away.
He stared at her for a few seconds, and then slowly approached, his footsteps barely audible. She stood motionless, as if rooted to the floor, feeling how every step he took brought them closer to the border they were both afraid to cross. When he approached her, their faces were only inches apart. His dark eyes looked right into her soul, and for a moment the whole world disappeared around her. There was no house, no streets, no city, just the two of them, standing on the edge of something new and dangerous.
"Do you understand what you're asking? What is it?"
He asked softly, his voice trembling with pent-up
Emotions.
She nodded, not knowing what to say. Everything inside her screamed that it was wrong, but she couldn't stop. This attraction became stronger than her will, and she knew that both of them had already gone too far to go back. He slowly reached out his hand, gently touching her face. His touch was gentle, but at the same time it felt like electricity ran through her skin. She closed her eyes, feeling her heart burst out of her chest.
"This is wrong."
He repeated, but his words no longer mattered. She opened her eyes and met his gaze. There was no longer any doubt or fear between them, only this strange, unexpected attraction that bound them together at this moment.
Sometimes wrong is all we have.
She replied softly, and they both knew there was no turning back. After that tense meeting in the kitchen between Adai and Abel, everything changed. And although at first glance their daily life continued to flow in the usual rhythm, something inside, in the invisible sphere of their relationship, shifted. Their lives intertwined like the roots of two old trees that had been growing side by side for a long time, but only now began to feel each other. Something invisible, but powerful, was binding them. This attraction that shouldn't have existed began to spread, filling every crack in their souls. A few days have passed. They rarely spoke, but their silence was intense. In every look, in every gesture, there was something more than simple words could express. Abel spent most of his time outside, walking in the garden, or sitting on an old wooden chair that stood under one of the trees. He rarely entered the house unless absolutely necessary, as if he was trying to create a safe distance between them. But this distance only increased the tension. Adai watched him, trying to sort out her feelings. She had never encountered such a paradox before. She was attracted to Abella by everything that should have repelled her. His age, his mystique, even his past, it all seemed like a barrier that she couldn't and didn't want to cross. And yet, every time she saw him, her heart beat faster, her breathing became heavier, and her thoughts became confused. She knew that their relationship was abnormal. Her mind tried to explain it as something temporary, as a simple curiosity or a desire to help another person. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the case. It was something else. Something she couldn't name, but she felt every second she spent with him. Sometimes at night, when the house was in darkness and the wind was blowing outside, Adai would lie in her bed and think about him. She imagined his face, his hands, every wrinkled curve of his skin, telling stories she would never know. These thoughts brought her to the brink of despair and delight at the same time. Her inner world became an arena for the struggle between reason and feelings, between what was right and what she wanted. But despite her best efforts to restrain herself, she knew that this conflict was already lost. They were both on a path from which there was no turning back. One evening, as the sun slowly sank below the horizon, painting the sky in dark orange and pink tones, the tension finally broke out. Adai stood by the window, watching Abel move through the garden, his figure slightly illuminated by the last rays of the sun. He was still calm, his movements slow and precise, as if every action had been thought out. But at that moment she realized that she couldn't just watch anymore. The weight of the accumulated emotions in her chest became unbearable. She could feel something exploding inside her as her heart began to pound wildly, and she could no longer ignore this feeling. She had to do something. She couldn't hide behind her integrity anymore, couldn't deny what was between them anymore. Without fully realizing her actions, she went outside. The air was cool but fresh, filling her lungs and as if pushing her to take decisive action. She walked quickly but silently, her footsteps almost inaudible on the soft ground. At some point, she noticed how Abel turned around, as if sensing her approach. Their eyes met, and at that moment, everything else ceased to exist. The world around me slowed down, as if the very air itself was frozen in anticipation. He didn't move, just stared at her with his deep, dark eyes that seemed to know more about her than she did. There were no words needed at that moment. There was everything in his gaze: recognition, acceptance, and the inescapable understanding that they both shared. She came closer, so close that she could feel his warmth. His hands dropped to his sides, as if he was resigned to what was going to happen next, as if he was ready to accept it, despite all the doubts and fears. She stopped in front of him, her breathing becoming ragged. A storm of emotions was raging in her chest, but she remained calm on the outside. Her gaze did not leave his face, and her hands involuntarily reached out to him. At that moment, the whole world narrowed down to one moment, one decision, one unspoken truth. She could feel the tension vibrating between them, an invisible force pulling them towards each other, despite all reasonable arguments and logical barriers. It was wrong, but it was true. And they both knew there was no point in fighting it anymore. Her hand touched his face, and the gesture was like an explosion. The barely perceptible touch tore apart all the boundaries they had tried so hard to hold. His skin was warm, but at the same time fragile, as if he was made of something ancient that was about to fall apart. She slowly ran her hand over his cheek, and at that moment it seemed to her that she was holding not just a person in her hands, but the whole world: his past, his pain, his secrets. Abel did not back down. He stood motionless, accepting her touch as if it were the last gesture he was allowed to feel. But there was something more in his eyes, a fire that burned under the mask of restraint. It was the fire of passion that was hidden behind his wisdom, behind his weariness of life. This fire was what connected them, what made their hearts beat in unison. She knew it was forbidden. She knew that society would condemn her if it found out. But none of that mattered at that moment. All the norms and rules that she had been trying to follow for so long collapsed like a house of cards in the face of this new, inexplicable connection. It was stronger than her, stronger than him, stronger than anything they could imagine. Abel slowly raised his hand, gently touching her hand, which was still resting on his cheek. The touch was almost imperceptible, but there was something incredibly intimate about it. He didn't push her away, didn't resist. He just accepted it as part of what was going to happen. They stood there for several minutes, lost in their thoughts and feelings. Adai felt her heart about to burst out of her chest as her breathing became heavier and heavier. It was like being on the verge of falling into an abyss, when you know you're going to fall, but you can't stop. And at that moment, something inside her gave up. She leaned closer, her lips gently touching his. It was a light, barely perceptible touch, but it caused an explosion of emotions in her. She felt her mind blurring, her whole body responding to that touch, as if it had finally found what it was looking for. Abel did not pull away. He accepted her kiss as something inevitable. His lips were soft and warm despite his age. It wasn't just a kiss, it was an admission that both of them could no longer deny what had happened between them. It was more than a physical attraction. It was a fusion of two souls who, despite all obstacles, found each other. After that moment, everything changed. Their bond, which up to this point had been only emotional, has now become physical. They couldn't hide their feelings anymore. Everything that was forbidden became real. Every touch, every look, every breath was now filled with this new energy, this passion that bound them. They spent more time together, their silent walks in the garden now filled with a secret intimacy that no one could understand. They no longer talked about what had happened between them. Words were superfluous. Everything was clear without them. Every night was different now. Adai could no longer sleep peacefully knowing that Abel was nearby. She could feel his presence even when he was in the other room. Their hearts were now beating in the same rhythm. Their souls were connected by an invisible thread that no one could break. This connection was wrong. It violated all the rules and principles, but it was true and undeniable. Every day they plunged deeper into it. Every time their eyes met, a spark ran between them that reminded them that there was no going back. After the border between Adai and Abel was crossed, everything around them seemed to change. Their relationship, which had been subject to internal struggles and forbidden thoughts for so long, had now turned into something so real that it could no longer be ignored. Adai felt her perception of the world change. The house she had lived in for several years was suddenly filled with an energy she hadn't noticed before. The rooms became warmer, but also more mysterious every corner. Every shadow now seemed alive, filled with their secret closeness. But with it came a sense of danger, an elusive but clear threat that this fragile bond could be broken at any moment. It's been a few weeks. Every day was full of tense silence, which was both disturbing and exciting. They still haven't talked about what happened between them. The words turned out to be too small and unnecessary to describe this powerful attraction, this passion that began to pulse in their every gesture, in every look. And yet, this new reality enveloped them more and more, bringing with it not only pleasure, but also fear. The fear of what might happen if this little world went beyond their home, if someone found out about what they were hiding. Adai felt that the society outside was beginning to notice the changes in her life. The neighbors, with whom she had previously politely exchanged pleasantries, now looked at her differently. It was barely perceptible, but still she felt their gazes, their suspicion. People started asking questions, innocent at first, but then more and more intrusive. They did not speak directly, but there was anxiety in their intonations and looks. Something had changed, and this something did not fit into the usual norms. Adai tried to ignore it, but deep down she knew that the secret she and Abel enjoyed would not be able to remain hidden forever. Every time she went outside her home to the store, to work, or just for a walk, she felt the shadows of suspicion following her. Those who had previously been indifferent to her life now began to closely observe her every move. Some neighbors began to stop her on the street, asking unexpected questions. How are you? Have you noticed anything unusual lately? These questions were a disguise in order to find out more information about her new roommate, who still rarely left the house. Abel seemed to sense this growing threat as much as she did. He became even more withdrawn, spending long hours outside, away from prying eyes. Sometimes he sat under the same tree in the garden, not moving, as if dissolving into nature, becoming a part of it. Other people might have passed by without noticing him, but Adai always felt his presence. His silence was filled with the same worries that plagued her. He knew that sooner or later their relationship would run into something insurmountable, and that something was beyond their control. One day when she returned home from work, she had a strange feeling that something was wrong. The house, usually so cozy and friendly, greeted her with a heavy silence that weighed on her from the very threshold. She walked down the hall, heading for the living room, and noticed that the door was ajar. It was a small thing, but her heart started pounding. There was tension in the air, and it seemed to her that every step was leading her to something inevitable. When she entered the living room, she saw Abel. He was standing by the window, his silhouette barely visible against the background of the falling light. His shoulders were tense, his hands were tightly clenched, and his head was slightly lowered. He seemed to be waiting for her. For the first time in a long time, his figure looked vulnerable. She felt a chill run down her spine. Without saying a word, she came closer to him and noticed that his face was serious, even sad. She knew that something important had happened, but she didn't dare ask. He handed her a piece of paper that he was holding in his hands. It was a letter, short but very clear. It said that one of the local residents contacted the police with questions about who exactly lives in her house. This someone began to investigate Abel's life, asking questions about his past, wondering why he was here and why he was hiding in her house. It was the beginning of the end of their little world. At that moment, all of Adai's worries became reality. They could no longer hide from society. What seemed so personal to her, so hidden, suddenly became the property of other people's eyes and ears. Abel also knew that their world was falling apart, and he accepted it with a heaviness that Adai could not fully understand. It was like a prediction that he had known from the beginning, but still tried to avoid. Now they were both on the verge of something they couldn't control. And although they didn't talk about it, their every action, every silent interaction was imbued with this awareness. They became even more cautious, even more withdrawn. Abel hardly left the house, fearing that he would be seen and identified. And going out into the street, felt as if she was under close observation. Her every movement, every glance, every step was perceived with suspicion. The rumors started spreading like wildfire. People were talking about an old man who lived with a young woman, about a strange guest who appeared suddenly and is now hiding in her house. Some even whispered that he might be a fugitive, that he was being chased, or that he had done something terrible. These rumors grew, and Adai realized that her time was running out. Their little secret could no longer exist as it was. What had happened between them was now a threat not only to their relationship, but also to her reputation. One evening, when the wind outside the window began to increase, she realized that something needed to be changed. She couldn't live in fear of what might happen anymore. But no solutions came. Each option seemed wrong. It was impossible to continue hiding Abel, but opening up to the world meant putting them both in great danger. Adai was sitting in her bedroom, looking out the window at the darkening sky. The wind stirred the leaves on the trees, as if nature itself was trying to warn her of an impending storm. 1,000 thoughts were spinning in her head, but none of them brought comfort. She knew it wasn't just a storm, it was a test of fate that was bound to overtake them sooner or later. The next morning, the situation escalated. When she left the house, a group of people were waiting for her on the threshold. They were her neighbors, the ones who had greeted her on the street with a smile before. Their faces were stern now, and their eyes were full of suspicion. They didn't say anything directly, but their silent presence said more than any words. They knew, or at least they thought they did, and now they wanted answers. Adai understood that she could no longer deny what was happening. She felt her heart constrict with fear. But with that came the realization that he and Abel had to accept the consequences of their actions. The secret they had been keeping for so long was now their test. And although she didn't know how it would end, she was willing to go through with it, even if it meant losing everything they had built. Now, everything depended on fate. They were both at her mercy, and all that remained was to wait for the end of this game.